Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, this morning, whatever it is for you. I want to welcome you to the Social Responsibilities Roundtable's annual Afternoon of Social Justice, where we convene cross-sector experts to discuss pressing issues and concerns that affect the field of librarianship and the values it embodies and promotes, like equity, inclusion, accessibility, diversity, and justice. The Social Responsibilities Roundtable, or CERT, is a unit within the American Library Association that believes libraries and librarians must center social responsibility by directly addressing social problems and inequities to work for the common good. One of the ways we help build this capacity is through popular education by hosting free events like this one throughout the year. My name is Rachel Rosekind. I'm a researcher, editor, consultant, and educator in the fields of economic, racial, and social justice. I also chair CERT's programming committee, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, April Shepard and Alicia Columbell, who will be assisting with tech and Q&A. And I'll just share a few housekeeping items before we get started introducing the session and our panelists. Because of ethical, environmental, economic, and other social justice considerations, CERT prohibits the use of AI during our programming unless there's an expressed accessibility need which it functions to meet. If this is the case, you may send, please, a message in the chat to the hosts and we will work to address it. If you'd like to enable captions, you can click more in the bottom right of the screen and click Show Captions. Our session today is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our website within a few weeks. It will also be sent to all registrants. This session focuses on building political power, civic agency, and voter mobilization, understanding how criminal legal system involvement impacts voting and spurs social change. Civic agency is about so much more than the ballot box, though having the right people in elected office certainly helps. Today, we'll hear from advocates, activists, and researchers dedicated to achieving racial justice, amplifying community power and voice, and unlocking access to full civic inclusion for currently and formerly incarcerated Americans. We have an incredible slate of speakers. Their full bios are included on our event page. For the sake of brevity, I'll introduce each one of them here with just a few sentences, and I'm sure they'll also share more about themselves during their presentations. And I'm going to introduce and share their bios in alphabetical order, and then there'll be a slight difference in presentation order. Dr. Kristen M. Budd is the Voting Rights Campaign lead researcher at the Sentencing Project. She's written about the link between voting rights and public safety and racial disparities due to state-level voting bans as a result of felony convictions. She also conducts research on criminal justice law, policy and practice, including sentencing for sex-related offenses, the link between incarceration and crime, and criminal legal reforms. She presents her work to academics, practitioners, and general audiences, and has been featured in outlets including USA Today and Yahoo News. Lenora Easter, Esquire, is senior counsel at the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, where she leads a statewide legal program focused on helping returning citizens restore their voting rights. In this role, she works with courts, clerks, state attorney offices, volunteer attorneys, and community partners to expand access to post-conviction relief and remove legal barriers to civic participation. She previously served as a public defender and supervising attorney in Orlando, Florida, and the Bronx, New York. Julius Irving is an activist, humanitarian, revolutionist, and modern-day alchemist devoted to the liberation, healing, and elevation of people and communities. He serves as community engagement coordinator for the Gainesville-based organization Community Spring. He previously served as a field organizer with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, helping secure the historic passage of Amendment 4, which restored voting rights to more than 1 million returning citizens across Florida. And sorry, I have to switch over. I realized my next bio is on a different page, so apologies for that. Okay, whoops. This is my one snafu, Antoinette's. I'm sorry, Antoinette, I'm gonna get to your bio in just a minute. Antoinette Ratcliffe is the executive director of Initiate Justice, a community-based organization that works to build the civic and political power of Californians who've been impacted by incarceration. Antoinette oversees the organization's operations, resources, and strategic efforts to empower system-impacted people to be civically engaged and to lead policy change across the state. Antoinette's passion for this work stems directly from lived experiences advocating for the freedom of her loved ones. And finally, Dr. Robert Stewart is an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Maryland. He studies the social, political, and collateral consequences of criminal records and criminal legal involvement, with an emphasis on the accumulating effects of criminal legal interaction and criminal records on impacted people and communities. Prior to joining the Maryland faculty, he was the founding research director of the Minnesota Justice Research Center, a nonprofit organization focused on community-focused and accessible research. Dr. Hannah Walker was supposed to join us today, but unfortunately had an unexpected conflict, so will not be able to. Before we begin, and we'll begin with Dr. Budd, we'll take questions for all the panelists after all of the presentations conclude. So all of the presentations will be run through, and then we'll take audience questions. Having said that, there's no need to wait to pose questions. You can do so at any time. Alicia has dropped a link to a shared document, which we'll use to pool questions and resources. And you can, if there's issues that you have with tech, you can place those in the chat, but otherwise, please try to use the document that Alicia has shared for your questions for our presenters. And I think that is it for me. I will now turn it over to Dr. Kristen Budd.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. So let me see if I can win with technology and actually do all the slide sharing so everybody can see it. All right, is that good? Everybody can, all right, thank you so much for the thumbs up and the heads nods. Now I have to find my other, there we go. So my name is Kristen Budd. I'm a senior research analyst at the Sentencing Project. So we're based in Washington, D.C. I am actually based in Ohio. I'm one of our remote employees. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about some of the research that we conducted in Maine and Vermont. So this research was also conducted with Rachel Didner-Jolly. She was one of our past research fellows at the Sentencing Project, and it was just such a huge support in tackling this work, especially when you're working with two separate states, two separate Department of Corrections, to learn about voting within inside of those facilities. So I'm going to walk you through the project. There'll be some charts and graphs, but a lot of this is also qualitative. So getting feedback from people who are incarcerated in those facilities to figure out, well, what works really well and what's a problem, right? What are the obstacles to voting while you're incarcerated? So I wanted to do just a little background if you're unfamiliar with the Sentencing Project. We are a nonprofit, like I said, based in DC. So we advocate for effective and humane responses to crime that minimize imprisonment and criminalization of youth and adults by promoting racial, ethnic, economic, and gender justice. So we have three strategic priorities at the Sentencing Project. So one is to end extreme sentencing. Another one is to expand voting rights. So making sure everyone can vote and also have real access to that vote. And then promoting youth justice. So my job at the Sentencing Project falls into two buckets. So I work in the first two strategic initiatives, so ending extreme sentences. And then I spend a lot of time working on our voting rights campaign as the lead researcher. So this work is very near and dear to my heart. And I'm very grateful that I can contribute and help advocates out on the ground to hopefully make very positive changes. So pre-TSP, I was faculty. I worked at Miami University in Ohio. So I was in the sociology department, ran the criminology program. I used to teach about felony disenfranchisement in my class. So completely different from classroom to actually on the ground applied research. So this has been a really life-changing opportunity to me to be able to do this work. So this was a bigger project that we started a couple years ago. So the full report is on our website. So as voting rights expand, we know, right, there's more access coming in jails. Also, our big question was, what can we learn from the folks who have never disenfranchised anyone for a felony conviction? So you've got now 4 places we can say, right? So Maine, Vermont, Washington, D.C. joined that list in 2020, and then also Puerto Rico. So the Sentencing Project, our goal is every single state and jurisdiction, right, flips over into that everyone can vote regardless of incarceration status. So we wanted to see, for the folks who have never disenfranchised, what kind of frameworks do they have set up within their facilities? How do they facilitate voting? What are the roadblocks? What can we recommend to make voting more accessible, to make sure it's a real right while you're completing your sentence? So we did a multi-pronged approach. So there was lots of different perspectives that we looked into. I'm just going to talk about one today, that for the folks who are serving a sentence, what did they tell us about what were the barriers? What did they tell us about what made voting easier? But we also talked to folks that partner with the DOC, so other nonprofits and advocacy groups as they worked with correctional staff. And then we also interviewed folks who worked with inside the facilities. So the staff members that were actually tasked, right, to implement policy and then make sure folks could vote while they're there. So today we'll focus on the barriers, right? Because the barriers are what we need to break down to be able to make sure folks can vote. So we did focus on Maine and Vermont. There has been some research done in the past on voting numbers for those 2 specific locations. So what we're seeing though is, even though the rights have always existed, we're not seeing a lot of turnout, right? So to me as a researcher, that's a red flag. So what's going on the inside where people have the right, but then we see these low numbers for turnouts during different elections? So for this research, we did focus on adults only, and 132 participants took part. So we did a survey. So folks answered close-ended questions, but also had lots of room to write in answers if they wanted to. So for Maine, we did a mail-in version. So we mailed the surveys there to have them completed. And then Vermont, I actually traveled there in person and then went to one of the facilities and went around to all the units and spoke with the guys and collected the data. So based on our analysis, I know this is a little bit of a busy slide, but these are some of the overall major findings that we had. So one of the big highlights is that voting was very important to these folks, right? 73% said that voting was important to them. But here's the big barrier, almost 50% said they didn't know how to vote at their facility. So for both of these states, it's mail-in. So you have to do the mail-in voting, which is multiple steps on top of getting registered. So we found there was lots of barriers to understand how to do that mail-in voting process. So once again, multi-step process. The information access is exceptionally limited in these facilities. So they were having a lot of trouble learning about candidates, making sure we could get enough information about candidates so we could be informed voters. There was a lack of guidance on voting dates and deadlines. One of the staff members that we interviewed, he was very transparent. He was like, everything in prison just takes 10 times longer than it would in the community. So you have a lot of lag, right? You not only have the internal mail system, then you have the community-based mail system, then you have the specific offices that receive the ballots in their hours. So everything just takes a lot longer. So knowing those dates and deadlines in advance really does come in handy, so you can start the process early given these specific constraints with the mailing system. We also found that staff needed training. Not all staff knew that individuals could vote, right? Certain staff did that were tasked with implementing voting, but some of the other staff weren't aware that these rights persisted as people were completing their sentences. And they also needed training on how to help people go about through that voting process. Other logistical challenges that we found, so limited access to paperwork. It's kind of one of those, you had to know who to ask. It wasn't just readily available, so you had to know to get your registration form or have someone assist you with figuring out how to request a ballot. The one thing I talked about was prison mail, because you have the internal factors with security checks, et cetera, and then also external community factors that you really have no control over there. And then also there's just never enough people, right, to do the work to help everyone that needs assistance with not only getting registered to vote, but then also figuring out how to request their own ballot. So lots of different facilities within these states. So making sure enough folks were available to help individuals there. So some of the other things that we found, we were curious, well, when you started to complete your sentence, when did you figure out that you could vote? Like, who told you? How long did it take? So 22% of the respondents said that they never figured out. No one ever told them that they could vote. Some folks it took greater than 6 months, but we do have at least a small percentage that did learn on the day of their arrival that they could vote, a small percent within 1 month, and then another handful within 6 months. So just a small caveat, some people couldn't remember when they learned, right? That was a large percentage there. But the thing I wanted to highlight here is who they were learning from. Most of the folks were learning from other people who were also incarcerated with them. So they weren't learning from staff, they weren't learning from case managers. Some of the other responses, literally the write-in answers were when they took our survey. That's when they found out they could vote. Other volunteers that were going into the facilities. Some folks said they did already know just from living out in the community. And then also the NAACP was a huge factor within the main system. Okay, so what would be helpful, right? So for individuals to be able to access this right and actually be able to vote, definitely information about candidates. So respondents could choose as many categories as they wanted here. So there was really a yearning for more information about candidates for that to be accessible. Having some type of public facing election calendar with dates so individuals would know this was coming up. A lot of interest in classes or programming. So learning about government generally, not just about the voting process itself. Having some type of peer mentor to be able to assist individuals as they go about that process. And then also folks also said having staff members help too. So once again, just for a little bit of context, as a friendly reminder, 55% of people couldn't access candidate information, 19% had limited access, and then the rest of folks had no access. 86% said they weren't getting reminders from DOC staff about important dates and deadlines. And then 49%, right? Almost 50% weren't sure how to vote at their actual facility. So these were some of the responses that they shared with us. So what makes it harder to vote? And the first step is knowing you can vote. So quite a few people wrote that they didn't know that they could still vote while they were completing their sentence. So, I'm under the impression that I do not have the right to vote. So that's the first thing we need to break down is making sure people are aware of their rights. A lot of folks said when they had registration drives, which happened in both states at the facilities, that they never felt like there was enough time, right? So you had all this turnout, you have limited person power, so there needs to be more time and also more like hands-on help with helping people fill out registration forms, so on and so forth. And then the last person commented about time. This directly relates to mailing. So at the time it takes to get the ballot to and from me. So a lot of time constraints there. So what would make it easier? Kind of the flip side of this, better access to political information, better access to paperwork. So you're not trying to figure out who to ask to get the paperwork, more access, more notice, and in-person voting, right? That was also a big one, is to be able to go and vote in person. All right, so how to improve access to voting in prisons. So these are just some of we had a lot of recommendations. This is a very small chunk that I'm presenting today. So the biggest one for us is implement in-person voting, right? So then people can just go, they learn the process. So Washington, D.C., they actually have individuals who are incarcerated run the polls. They earn some money while they do it. So it's just a really great experience to feel connected to the voting process and also to the community. Could also benefit staff members, right? Because then you can also vote while you're on the job and you don't have to go somewhere else to vote. Make sure we're increasing education, not only for people who are completing those sentences that they know they can vote, but also for staff, right? So staff aren't accidentally spreading misinformation about voting rights. We also suggested absentee ballot clinics because it seems like they tackle the registration part pretty well, like having the registration clinics where they help folks, even though we know you need more people, you need more time. But then there's a big gap. People aren't sure, okay, what's the next step? How do I request my ballot? How do I get that? So we recommended maybe consider implementing one of those so people can get help on requesting their ballots. Definitely increasing information to candidates, also voter referendum information. I would also love to see this at a reading level that is appropriate for those who are consuming the information versus a bunch of legalese that I even often have to Google because I'm like, what does this mean? And then we also strongly suggest access to the state-run voter registration website, right? To whether it's the Secretary of State's office or whoever is running that official state platform. Why can't people get on to look things up on the state-run voting rights website, right? So that's a big one for us. And then also allowing groups who can write the nonpartisan candidate guides to have access to bring those into the facilities, either as hard copy or a PDF, right? So if folks have access to tablets, they could just like download it on their tablet and be able to read the PDF. So I'm a huge advocate of also permitting online registration, online ballot requests, and also ballot tracking. So once people vote, they could then follow their own ballot to make sure that it's delivered, so on and so forth. All right, so I didn't time myself, so hopefully I didn't take up too much time. But to learn more about us, there's a QR code here. This will take you to our voting rights website page with all of our advocacy work, with all of our publications. But every single person should be able to vote regardless of conviction or incarceration status. And that is what we are working for here at the Sentencing Project. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. Such incredible work. And I have a bunch of questions. I'm sure our audience will have other questions too. And you were perfect. Nice time. So Dr. Robert Stewart, would you like to go next?
I would be happy to. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe I'm going to set the stage, I think, for many of the later presenters and talk about kind of the state level policy change in disenfranchisement policies over time. And so I'm going to present a little bit of work that I have with some colleagues as well as based on a report that we put together with the Sentencing Project, actually. And so I'm going to talk about felony disenfranchisement and democratic expansion. I'm going to have a positive story, so we're all going to be happy about this. Okay, so you may or may not remember 2000. In the year 2000, there was a pretty significant election. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this is what the disenfranchisement, state level disenfranchisement policy looked like throughout the United States. So the darkest kind of red or maroon colors are states in which people are who are in prison, parole, probation, and even after their sentence are disenfranchised. So in other words, in many of these states, at least in 2000, people were disenfranchised for life, such as Iowa, Kentucky, Virginia, and Florida. And then in others, there was maybe like a 5-year period after the sentence was up, or some other kind of like time period like that, waiting period, I guess. And then in of course you have Maine and Vermont, the two states that, oh, I screwed up this. So sorry, Maine and Vermont, there's no restrictions, as Kristen just talked about, or Dr. Budd just talked about. But then you have kind of some of these ones in the middle, right? So the kind of pinkish, the color that Texas is, those Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, etc. Those are states in which people who are under some type of correctional control in the year 2000 were not able to vote. So if you were in prison, if you were on parole, you're on felony probation, you would not be allowed to vote in those states. And then the lighter states were ones where either it's just prison and parole, like California and New York, or it was just prison, right? So Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. So these are the states that when you were in prison, when you were in prison, you weren't able to vote, but once you were released, you could vote. So that's what the landscape looked like in the year 2000. You may or may not remember there was a pretty significant. Oh, wait, sorry. I put these in the wrong order. So if we were to estimate based on this map, and we were to estimate, okay, how many people were disenfranchised, right? We would estimate that in the year 2000, there were about 4.5 million people who couldn't vote because they were on some type of correctional control or in a state where they were prohibited from voting, right? And that's a pretty big number. It definitely had seen an increase since the 1980s, which you would expect with the kind of the war on drugs and the kind of the growth of mass incarceration in the United States. And then the reason I pick out the year 2000, obviously, is because there was this big election, right? Bush v. Gore. Famously, George Bush won the election with 537, or he lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College because in the state of Florida, specifically, he won by 537 votes. And of course, we have the famous picture of the guy looking at the hanging Chad, which is like my favorite thing. And so this was a pretty big deal, right? 537 votes in a state in which there were roughly 6 million votes cast. That's a very tiny percentage. So in the early 2000s, Chris Eugen and Jeff Manza, they had wondered, well, what is the role that disenfranchisement had on the outcome of this election? And so they wanted to propose a counterfactual of what it might have looked like, right? And so importantly, I mentioned 4.5 million or so people that were disenfranchised in 2000. About 820,000 of those people were in the state of Florida, right? And so lots of them were on probation. Some of them were in prison and in other statuses, but the vast majority, 600,000 or more, were prohibited from voting after they had finished and completed their sentence. And so Eugen and Manza decided, well, what would have happened if those 613,000 people would have been eligible to vote if Florida did not disenfranchise post-sentence? And so the actual numbers are down here at the bottom, right, where this is the actual outcome. And according to and I'm actually being more conservative here than Eugen and Manza. So if we estimate that 600,000 people, if 10% of those people turned out, and that was a 45 Republican, 55 Democrat split, which is pretty narrow, and probably more conservative than it would have been at the time, we'd estimate that about 6,000 that Al Gore would have gained about 6,000 votes and a net of about 5,500, right? In other words, disenfranchisement as a state level policy really makes a difference in terms of and can make a difference in terms of election outcomes. I encourage you to read their book called Locked Out, which they go back to Senate elections. They start with Mitch McConnell's election in Kentucky in the early 80s. It's really fascinating stuff. So they wrote this paper called Democratic Contraction, right? And basically the idea was they looked at the history of race-based disenfranchisement policies, which really spiked after following the Civil War and Reconstruction, and particularly in the South, but also throughout other states in the United States. And they made this argument that, look, like we are restricting, we're contracting the promise of democracy through this policy. But what I'm going to talk about today is not that. I'm actually going to update this because more recently we can talk about democratic expansion. And so this is based on a paper. You like that? So this is based on a paper that I have that's under review with Chris Eugen and Ryan Larson, and we want to chart or talk about how disenfranchisement has changed in recent years. And so, excuse me. So this is the estimated disenfranchisement population continuing on from 2000. It peaked in 2016 at about 5.9 million people. Again, a huge number of people, right? The 2016 election was what we estimate as the highest point of the most people who were disenfranchised because of a felony record in the history of this country. But since then, that number has gone down, and it's gone down precipitously. And in fact, in the most recent federal election, 2020 or in 2024, we estimate actually that the disenfranchisement population has dropped by more than 30%, and is closer to around 4 million now. Wow, right? That's a huge drop, 30%. Like that's a real positive story, right? And it's happened because the state level advocacy organizations and state level action has really has really changed the landscape of felony disenfranchisement. And so again, this is what it looked like in 2000. But then in 2016, you see some states got more restrictive between 2000 and 2016. But then when you start moving forward, 2020, 2024, right? States are shifting towards away from they're restricting the scope of disenfranchisement. States are moving towards what we would call more liberal, like small L liberal disenfranchisement policies, in which now the modal state now, the most typical state level policy is disenfranchising based on whether the person is in prison or not. And this is 2024. Since then, Missouri has since relaxed some of their disenfranchisement policies. You may have heard Virginia had a case where a federal court had found that their disenfranchisement policy as applied was unconstitutional or violated the Reconstruction readmission bill. Anyway, the point is, this is a really big deal and it's a really positive story. And the other thing that we're seeing is it's not just overall changes, but we're also seeing a decrease in the disenfranchisement rate for Black Americans who are disenfranchised. And so the gap has been closing, and we have a similar gap that's been closing for between women and men. And so I think all in all, we're seeing a really positive story, and this movement I think is continuing to happen. This is happening because of advocates, organizations, people on the ground, people in local groups who are working together, working with their legislatures to try to really change policy. And so we don't get a lot of positive stories when it comes to this area when it comes to the criminal legal system, but this is one, and I think it's something that we should celebrate. And so if you want to read more about this, there's this report is published called Locked Out 2024. That there's a QR code, you can scan it. Other than that, I'd be happy to answer any questions when we get done.
Thank you. Always good to have some good news and a positive trend. So thanks for that. Lenora, would you like to go next? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Robert Stewart. You've set it up nicely for me to talk about FRRC and the work that we have done here in Florida. But before we get into that, my name is Lenora Easter, and as Rachel pointed out, I am the Senior Counsel here at Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, which is formerly also known as FRRC. I want to talk to you first about who we are and why this particular work. So, FRRC is a grassroots membership-led organization that's led by returning citizens and their allies. And returning citizens are individuals who have felony convictions. We are based out of Orlando, but our work expands across the entire state of Florida. Our mission extends beyond restoring voting rights. We work to remove barriers that prevent individuals from fully participating in civic and community life. We believe that successful reentry is about more than just leaving the criminal justice system when your case is done. It's about creating opportunities for people that reconnect them with their families, their communities, and with democracy. This mission naturally leads into our vision, which is a vision that builds a movement of returning citizens, community leaders, advocates, and allies that work together to strengthen civic participation and advance justice. Voting rights restoration is one important part of the vision, but it's really about empowering people to become active participants in their communities, right? To be able to vote, to volunteer, to lead, and to help shape the future of their neighborhoods. And what I appreciate most about FRRC is that we don't just focus on the legal outcomes of an individual's case. We focus on the person. We focus on people. We recognize that restoring rights is one step towards returning is towards restoring belonging, opportunity, and civic engagement. So I want to just talk a little bit about why this work matters to me and why I am even a here at FRRC. I've been an attorney for over 18 years. I've worked as a public defender, started out my career in Orlando, Florida, where I defended thousands of indigent individuals in both felony and misdemeanor cases. I'm from New York, so I went back home to New York and I worked at the Bronx Defenders doing holistic work, which I supervised an interdisciplinary team of social workers, investigators, attorneys, and support staff, where we focus not only on the criminal cases, but on the drivers that brought the individual even into the system, and worked on a holistic approach to be able to make them productive individuals in society. I then went on to do national work with Partners for Justice, where I set up these holistic programs in various public defenders' offices across the nation. And now I'm here as a senior counsel at FRRC, leading a statewide program to help returning citizens restore their right to vote. And it doesn't matter what state I'm in or what role I find myself in, there is one consistent reality. The consequences of a criminal conviction rarely end when the sentence ends. People feel the effects of the arrests or the convictions long after they have served their time. They have turned their lives around. They are working, productive members of societies. They have families, yet and still the sting of their criminal convictions haunts them and follows them for a long, long time. And I want to be able to show you today how FRC is addressing one of those collateral consequences, which is restoring the voting rights. So, as Dr. Stewart pointed out, here in Florida, we have one of the most restrictive abilities for folks or being permanently disenfranchised for folks to be able to vote if you have a felony conviction. A felony conviction is often resulting in the loss of the right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to sit for a jury, the right to bear for arms, as well as other rights that they lose. And the only way before Amendment 4 came into play was that they had to go through the clemency process, which is more than is where the government or the governor made the decision of whether or not that person would be able to get their rights restored. So people think about felonies and they often think about violent crimes. And felonies, not all felonies are violent. If you look at this list, there's some things on here that's like, yes, driving with a suspended license. Sometimes people know about and sometimes they don't. Trespassing on a construction site. This one was interesting to me, disturbing turtle nesting eggs. But these are things that permanently disenfranchise an individual from being able to have rights, including the right to vote. Some folks, when they were charged as youths, that were charged as adults, lost their right before they even got their right. So Amendment 4 in 2018 changed all of that. 65% of the votes, Florida citizens voted to pass Amendment 4 and said yes to a second chance. But the government, of course, did not like that was the case. And this wasn't just a law. This was a constitutional amendment to the Florida Constitution that got passed. So about a year later, they came back and they enacted SB 7066, also known now as Florida Statute 98.0751, that said in order for an individual to be able to get their right to vote back, they have to complete all terms of sentence. And it wasn't automatic upon the release of prison. It meant now you had to pay your full fines and fees. So what was once a felony conviction that stood between the returning citizen and the ballot box now is monetary, is their fines and fees. So the legal financial obligations that are talked about in this statute consist of three buckets of costs. We have court costs, which are administrative in nature, fines and fees, which are imposed as part of a sentence, and then restitution, which if an individual, if there's a victim, an entity that has been harmed as a result of the crime, they are to be made whole by having, be paid back. But the issue around this is not necessarily just the fact that they have to pay these fines and fees. The issue is, how much do they owe? It's like somebody telling you to pay your bill to turn your lights back on, and you say, well, how much is the bill? Just pay it. I don't know. How do you have somebody do that. It just doesn't resonate, doesn't make sense. But that was the problem. And that still is kind of somewhat of the problem that we were seeing, was that individuals were told that they can get your rights back, but you have to pay. But they weren't able to know what it is that they had to pay because there was inconsistencies within the clerk system as far as what an individual owed. There were records that were missing, especially if somebody had a conviction that was decades ago. And so that was one problem. But then it was like, okay, once I figure out what I do owe, if I can't pay it, what are my options at that particular point in time? And so that's where the FRC's fines and fees team comes in. We are here to answer the question and the hurdles that stand in the way of a returning citizen and their voting rights under this statute. So our attorney assistance program, which I lead, under the statute, it gives an individual three mechanisms by way that they can take care of their outstanding legal financial obligations. They can pay it in full. They can go and have the court waive it, which I'll tell you right now rarely happens. But a person can do a motion, ask the court to waive the fines and fees, and it'll be up to the discretion of the court. They can do it partially or entirely, but again, like I said, rarely happens. But the option that we utilize the most is conversion, where we go in and we ask the court to take those financial obligations, those court costs, those fines and fees, and convert them to community service so that an individual can go out, make an impact in their community, and then get their fines and fees eradicated. The goal here is to be able to remove the financial barriers that are permitted by this law so that eligible returning citizens can then complete their sentence and get their rights restored upon them. So I'm going to just go through a couple of the steps that kind of my program does, and then how we address the problems and the questions that we see in the hurdles. So as I stated, one of the hurdles is, how do I know what I owe? Well, FRC and the state of Florida came to an agreement once we sued them after enacting 98.0751, where the state would agree that after an individual fills out a one-page advisory opinion, that they would come back within 90 days and they would let the returning citizen know what it is that they owe, because the onus is on the state. It's not on the returning citizen. The report comes back and gives three responses. Either you owe you owe an amount. This is what it is that you owe that you must be able to take care of before you can get your rights restored. You don't owe and you are eligible to register to vote, or we are not able to make a determination, and we call it the tie goes to the runner. When we get a response back that says that, an individual can still go and vote with the protection of this advisory opinion report. If at some point in time in the future, the state comes back and say, oh, we actually found that you owed something, but you voted, they cannot prosecute them for voter fraud. So once research is completed, our program then takes that research and turns it into the armor that the attorneys use to go into court to file the motions. We recruit, we train, and we give these motions to the attorneys. They go into court and they advocate for our returning citizens. And what that advocacy, again, is asking the court to waive, but in the alternative to convert. And like I said, for the most part, we get the second part. And what we do is we do all the research in-house. We have attorneys that volunteer with us, and attorneys can be from out of state that do that part. They don't have to be Florida barred to do it. And they help us to figure out what it is that an individual owes. We do the advisory opinion. We do the motions. The attorney then goes into court. They do the advocacy. And then we come back. And we have an in-house community service program where our returning citizens can come and they can do the community service with us. We have what we call community talks. It's kind of like our in-house Oprah show, where we have the individuals come and they talk about podcasts, they talk about civic engagement, they talk about the things that are going on. And it's also a healing group for the returning citizens because they're able to be amongst other folks that are going through similar situations and circumstances that they can then relate to. They get community service hours for that, but we also partner with outside organizations that then our returning citizens can go and they can do events, they can do soup kitchens. We work with faith-based organizations such as churches to be able to get them their community service hours completed. And the goal for this is to make sure that we're connecting returning citizens to meaningful opportunities. A lot of times when we say community service, the first thing that comes to mind for returning citizens is I got to stand on the side of the road picking up trash. And they're like, but I did my sentence. I did my time. Why do I have to do this? And we recognize that. We hear them. And at the end of the day, they're right. So we want to make this not only educational for them, but meaningful in the sense that, yes, they're giving back, they're building connections, they're helping the community, but they're learning at the same time as they move forward towards their rights restoration. And then once they have completed their community service, the attorney goes back into court to show that proof, and they get a completion order from the court. Now, the court cannot make the determination that an individual has the right to vote. They can only make the determination that they have completed all terms of the sentence, which is required under 98.0751. The returning citizen will then take that order and go to the supervisor of elections where they will run their, information, make sure that they're good, allow them then to register. And then that brings that returning citizen one step closer to being able to be at the ballot for the next election cycle. So the impacts and the North Star as to what is the impact that we're doing here, right? Every case for us represents a person. It's not a legal file. As an attorney, and a public defender, I represented thousands of individuals. And in a courtroom with so many people, they were just looked upon as just a case number, not a person. And with us, we humanize and we recognize people. When you are going through this situation, it's not just you, it's your family, it's your community. It affects everybody. So we look at it in a sense that we're looking to restore an individual's voice, strengthen the families, be more engaged in our community, and also have fairness as it relates to justice. Because like I said, behind every case number is a person and it's a family, it's a future. Our North Star for our work as we move forward in doing this helps us to be guided by 3 commitments. We want to continue to expand access to justice for individuals. The work that we do not charge our returning citizens for it. And many places you go that you're not going to get that unless you have a public defender and you're already in the system. But we do this work for free. We want to build collaborative partnerships with organizations, people, not only in Florida, but across the nation. And we want to be able, to strengthen our community because it's a domino effect, right? When we restore that right upon that person is then able to have that monkey of fines and fees off their back. They're able to get a job. They're able to be productive individuals in their community, and they're able to then go on to run for office or do things and be able to strengthen their community in that positive way. And I want to leave you with a quote from Desmond Meade, who is FRC's founder, who was the brainchild behind Amendment 4, and who is now currently going off to do amazing things in Florida. He states here that I believe that we are a nation of second chances. When a debt is paid, it's paid. It should not be a lifetime of sentence of civil disabilities. So I want to thank you. And this is my email. This is also my contact information. Please take it down. If you are looking to volunteer with FRC and you're in Florida, we would welcome that. It's an election season. We need you to help us to get out the people to vote. Consider volunteering with us. But thank you so much for all of your support.
Thank you. Fantastic. And thanks for including that information. I'm going to ask at the end about ways to get involved in advocacy next steps, because I think that's really something that we like to share and activate for our audience. So, Julius, are you ready?
Yes, I am. I'm ready. Right. So, and also, this was a brief heads up. I don't have any slides available, so the only visuals y'all will be getting is my handsome face. So be prepared for that. Okay, so I'll give y'all a little bit of a backstory about me, how I got into this work, and what drives my passion, right? Early in life, right, when I was a child, I recognized that there was a huge difference between the life I saw on TV and the life that was happening in my community. I grew up watching shows like Family Matters, Full House, and all of this stuff, and what I saw on TV just wasn't happening in my community. So there was a disconnect, and I started recognizing that, hey, are we poor? I think we might be poor, you know, and I recognized as I became older that my parents taught me how to like adapt and conform to the system, not that I could change it. And nothing in school, nothing taught me that I could really change the systems around me or change the way my neighborhood was, other than the Black Panthers, right? So I fell in love with the Black Panthers. I fell in love with Malcolm X. I fell in love with Stokely Carmichael and all these people, and I wanted to be like them. And that kind of like was the seed sown in me for who I am today, in spite of what was happening outside of me, right? And as I got older, I started really caring about loving myself more, loving my community more, and recognizing that my community specifically is faced with a lot of issues, right? And I just started trying to just help on my own accord. I was working at the Waffle House, making like $700 a week, which was a lot of money for me at the time, going to Santa Fe College. And I started just doing like advocacy work in my own community, helping people get out of incarceration with boots and IDs and stuff. And then somebody nominated me to go to a men's retreat hosted by Desmond Meade. And that's how I came in contact with FRC. And they was the first people to ever give me a paid opportunity to do this kind of work. I had been doing it because it was something I was passionate about first. But I recognized that barrier where if you're not being paid to do it, it's hard to continue to do it, you know, because you still got to like the cost of living, pay bills, and all this other stuff. So they gave me my first paid opportunity. And that's when I really started understanding democracy and, you know, politics more. Because all before that, right, I didn't believe in the system at all. I didn't believe in voting at all. Desmond Meade really helped me understand the power in voting when I understood what Amendment 4 was about, how registered voters could sign a petition and then change something that had been a part of Florida since Florida existed. I was like, wow, that's powerful. That's the first time I ever understood the power of the vote. And it wasn't necessarily the individual vote, it was the collective vote. The educated collective vote is very powerful. And I thought that that's the disconnect between what's happening here, right? I noticed that a lot of funding and money came in my town when it came close to election time. And it was just all about voter registration. Get people registered to vote, get people registered to vote, but no kind of education to teach them how to vote in an educated way, not an emotional way. A lot of people vote because I just don't want to see that person inside of the office, not because any kind of actual politics, right? So, and then, you know, I personally, during that time between FRC and my work with Florida Immigrant Coalition, I got like 7,000 something people registered to vote single-handedly in 1 year. And the New York Times came down to do an article about Amendment 4, but when they found out about me and all that I had done, they made a story about me and about Amendment 4, right? And I wonder, of those 7,000 people, plus people that I got registered to vote, how many people actually turned out to the polls and how many people actually cared about politics, had enough information to make an educated vote. And to me, I don't think it was many, right? Because of the 7,000 people that I got registered to vote, over half of those people didn't care. They really did it because I had to beg them, like, hey, please just do it for me. If I get 10 people signed today, I can go home. I'm at number 8. 2 more signatures, I can go home. They're okay, I'll do it for you. So I really cared about, you know, educating. If it was like that for the bulk of the people that I registered to vote outside of my community, how much more is it for the people in my community that they don't know about voting? Even if I got them registered, they wouldn't care enough to go out to the polls and do it. So that began my want and desire to facilitate or create some kind of political education / civic engagement program. And then I met Max and Lindsay here at Community Spring, went through their fellowship. I wanted to do political education as a focus goal for our fellowship, but we landed on housing. And then here I am as an employee 4 years later, and we're finally getting to actually do the program. And I'm really excited about it. So now I'm going to dig into some of the scope and the purpose of the work that I do here at Community Spring, right? So I'm the community engagement coordinator. I run a few programs under the JEST community pillar of our organization. My work is local. It's deeply rooted in the communities that have been, disproportionately affected by systemic neglect, harmful public policy, poverty, mass incarceration. Those are some of the demographics that I do it for. People who live in communities where they're at a high risk of becoming incarcerated or high crime areas. People living at or below the poverty line, trying to encourage them and influence them to see their own power. So that's the demographic I work with. Some of the programs that I run, though, right? It's the Letter Write Initiative, where like everyday people from our community with different backgrounds come and sit at a conference table and connect with each other first and foremost. And secondly, they write letters to the incarcerated people here in the county jail to let them feel seen and to let them know about Community Spring and what we do here. Then we have our Storytelling for Change workshops, right? In these workshops, we teach people how to tell their story in a more impactful way, in a way that empowers them as a storyteller, but also informs the listener and offers a truer telling of systemic issues that stats can't always capture. Stats doesn't capture everything that's happening out here. So we teach people how to tell their stories in a way that first and foremost empowers them, empowers their community, and it can also be used for a systemic change, right? And we found out that this storytelling itself is an act of healing, but it's also a tool for civic engagement and advocacy. And then last but not least, the program that's most relevant to this webinar, we have our community power building workshop, right? We hosted right in the heart of the communities. We don't ask them to come to us, we go to them. And it is geared towards strengthening civic power by helping people understand how government works, how decisions are made, who to hold accountable for what, and the best ways to hold them accountable. I found out too, right, that my initial approach to it was like all about voting, all about political engagement. I found that people in these communities that I serve just really don't trust the system, right? They really don't. They don't believe in funneling their energy through the system. So it's hard for me one of the hardest things for me initially was to overcome the hopelessness of some of those people in these communities, right? Hold on just a second. It was dealing with the hopelessness in these communities. And I found out that there isn't like a lack of information. A lot of these people in the demographic that I serve knew a lot of the information I was teaching. It was just that they just simply didn't believe in it. So, and we also have this idea, right, that civic power is about voting alone. There's this common misconception. Hold on, I was reading for some notes here. I kind of got lost a little bit. Okay, yeah, there's a common misconception that civic engagement, right, begins and ends with voting alone. Voting is definitely an essential part of it, right? But to me, civic participation engagement is about building relationships, organizing yourself and your neighbors. It's about serving your community, and it's about just participating in public life throughout the whole year, not just during election time. And one of the most encouraging things that I've seen, though, in the work that I'm doing recently is that more impacted people have been trusted to tell our own stories and are brought into leadership roles. That's something that I like to see more often. I think we have a greater impact in just civic engagement if we invested in more impacted people to be leaders to their peer group, because I found out that we're influenced the most by our peer group, right? If I went to a class on how to be a better Black man and an old white woman came out to teach it, she may have some of the best points in the world, but because she's not the right messenger, the information may not sit too well, right? So I think it's super important that we invest in leadership that reflects the communities that they're going out to lead and teach. We'll have a greater impact. And I also came across this thing, right? Well, how do you get people to care about politics who don't feel a sense of connection or ownership to the place where they stay? Most people who vote typically own their home, they own their property, they own their land. So they feel like, I own Gainesville, I own a piece, so I'm going to fight for it. But how do you get a person living at or below the poverty line to care about their communities as much? When the only thing they own is their clothes. They're renting their apartment, they're renting their car, they're going to work. If they even are working, they're giving up an hour of their life for $10 an hour. You know what I'm saying? So how do you get a person like that to actually care about what's happening enough to get out and do something about it. And some of the approaches that I had, right, was going into community. Instead of just teaching about politics, I started teaching about history, right? History of change makers who look like the demographic that I'm serving, and how some of the rights that we currently have, all of this stuff was fought for. And I was surprised at how many people in these communities didn't know about the contributions of the Black Panthers, some of the things that they had done with free meals at schools didn't exist before the Black Panthers for anybody. Well, anybody, white, Black, Spanish, whoever, but the Black Panthers as a group of people organized and started understanding the relationship between food health and mental health, and started doing the breakfast program, and that went on to be a thing that society does. And I want to remind people that change doesn't happen because systems allow it, right? Because people think that change happens in the community because systems allow it, but change actually happens when people get together and decide to care about each other and do something about it. That's the way change happens, not the other way around. So I've had a better success, right, at just building civic power, thinking about it as building the agency in each individual person, but also building the collective power, right? Because agency says I can, civic power says we can, right? So returning that sense of political identity to the people. And for me, political identity isn't like the same as political affiliation. Political identity is how a person understands themselves as a participant in public life and democracy. It includes what they believe, what matters to them, how they see their role in shaping their community. So returning like political identity with a sense of individual agency, and couple that with collective action, right? Like, for example, if you want to teach a person to fight who doesn't believe in, doing anything violent, you wouldn't tell them you teach them to fight. You would just teach them like foot movement, head movement. And when the time came for the fight to happen, they already have the skill set. So I don't tell people that I'm teaching them to engage in the system. I teach them the skill sets of how to address their own problems, how to hold like the church. I'm getting them to work with the churches in the community as a 501c3 that they're connected to. And so yeah, I think the key thing is investing in people, not just information, but connection. It's hard to get people to actually trust you and change and do things with you. You don't have a connection. And that's a huge missing piece in this work too, right? I've seen a lot of organizations doing this kind of work. They come in these neighborhoods, but they have no connection with the demographic that they're serving. And they don't even make eye contact, no handshakes, no any of that kind of stuff. And I've attended a lot of these classes, right? And I felt like the people in the classes weren't the people that needed to hear it the most. So a part of my work is learning this stuff myself, right? Cutting through all of the academic jargon and breaking it down into understandable terms and taking it to the community, adding practical use to it. And I've had like a decent result, way better than I did when I was taking the other approach, as far as like heavy politics, voting, Senate this, House this. Like, people knew it already, they just didn't care. Like, they much rather do something that they feel they have some kind of control over. So we've been doing stuff like organizing community events. We're doing this community potluck. We have a connection with an organization in town called the Bread of the Mighty that brings out food to this community, and we're going to create a free breakfast, lunch, or dinner program in this community. So just teaching the community how to hold the system accountable, right? But also what to do in the meantime while we're waiting for the system to catch up and catch on. And the communities that I serve like that better than just coming in and saying, even when I showed them, right, it was a specific local thing going on that affected their community personally. And they still didn't care. It was like, yeah, I hear you, but they just didn't care about it. So I'm trying to reestablish not a trust in the system, but a trust in each other, that anything that we work toward, we can change. And I think that that's a way that we need to go. And I'll end it there. I think did I hit the 15-minute mark? Do I have more time?
I'm really bad at tracking time. I get wrapped up in everything. We are definitely good on time, and you just definitely, the work you're doing and what you provided is so inspiring. And I'm glad you mentioned partnerships. I'm going to ask everyone about those later as well. Okay. Last but not least,
Good morning for some or afternoon for others. My name is Antoinette Radcliffe. I'm the Executive Director of Initiate Justice. And I'm excited to be here today. I'm going to talk primarily about the work that we've done here in California and the strategies and efforts that we found to work. And it truly aligns with a lot of what the other panelists have talked about, learning through studies and surveys or learning through their direct work. And I'm excited to sort of share a little bit of kind of what that could look like in practice as well, or what it does look like in practice here in California. So first, a little bit about Initiate Justice. Our mission is ultimately to end mass incarceration and criminalization of our communities by activating the political power of the people who are most impacted by it. And so I think a prime example of that is my own connection to this work, or why I come to this work. So I actually came to this work in civics or in policy advocacy through Initiate Justice as a participant and volunteer in one of our core programs. That was about 8 years ago. And it was because I was actively supporting and advocating for my loved ones, my brothers, all of whom were incarcerated at the time and had been since their youth and since my youth. Today, I'm happy to say that 2 of those 3 brothers of mine are home, and unfortunately, one is serving a life without the possibility of parole sentence plus 241 years, which speaks a lot to the overall carceral sort of apparatus in California, which hands down some of the most extreme sentences, and which makes this work of civic engagement and activating political power inside of our facilities all the more critical, especially during the times that we're in. So a little bit about the background of Initiate Justice and sort of why we exist in the first place. We were founded back in 2016 inside of a prison visiting room, with our co-founders recognizing that folks who were being affected by all of the sort of criminal justice reforms that were coming really popular around that time, because if many of you remember, it was shortly after California had been sued for overcrowding, and so they were needing to expeditiously reduce prison populations. However, the decisions that were being made at the state level rapidly and consistently were being made without information getting back to the folks inside of the prisons, without consulting with or learning insights and stories and experiences from the folks inside of the prisons. And really, it was just a system of decisions being made about people without their input or without their humanity being considered in the first place. And that sort of established the premise of Initiate Justice. And our primary model is grounded in the belief that people who are closest to the problem, which a lot of people talked about here, the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. They have the intimate insights and knowledge needed to truly eradicate the underlying conditions that create the problem, as opposed to sort of what happens oftentimes when people who are closest to the issue are removed, is all of the efforts are focused on the symptoms and not the underlying problems. When you engage the folks who have struggled through, who have survived the issues that you're working to transform, that is when you start to get to the root causes and start to truly create new systems that maybe don't rely on things like harm, punishment, and violence in the first place. So that's sort of the overall premise of why we exist. And we do understand that in order to achieve true public safety, we have to address harm prevention. We have to address the conditions and cultures that perpetuate harm and violence, as opposed to just attacking the symptoms or the results of harm happening after the fact. So we are led by, our entire organization is led by people who are directly impacted. So our staff and our board comprise of folks who are formerly incarcerated and folks like myself who have or have had incarcerated loved ones. And I'll focus a lot of this sort of talking about a lot of our work in terms of how we have been effective in empowering folks inside of our prisons to engage in our democracy I do want to make the very clear distinction that unlike, Maine, Vermont, DC, and Puerto Rico, as Dr. Kristen Budd talked about, in California, people in our state prisons cannot vote. Everyone else, in other words, folks who are on parole, thanks to work that was done back in 2020 that we spearheaded, can vote. People in our jails can vote, and anyone else with a conviction who is on, community post-release community supervision or anything else or not can vote as well. However, the folks in our state prisons do not have the right to vote as of today. So I think, let me go to the next slide, but as I jump into sort of what we do, I do want to draw attention to the fact that this entire conversation is really critical at a time when across the nation, folks are trying to fight fascism, protect civil liberties, strengthen our democracy for mere survival. And oftentimes when we're having those conversations, impacted people and felony disenfranchisement are folks who don't have access to our democracy in the first place are largely left out of the conversation. Meanwhile, across the nation, as you've heard from folks before me on this panel, and as I'll talk about here today, people in our prisons are educating themselves and their peers, are engaging with the different areas of our democratic and civic systems that they can get access to, and are trying to meaningfully support and impact our communities, even while being formally disenfranchised. So a little bit about our efforts, we use, similar to some of what was talked about already, we use an inside-outside organizing model in accomplishing this work, which means we are working directly within the state prisons, connecting with folks, providing education, tools, and resources. Our work entails multiple methods of not just education and training, but also resource distribution to support the pro-social engagement and civic participation of folks who are in all 31 of our state prisons in California. I want to pause and highlight one thing. Today, our work reaches folks in all 31 state prisons. In 2016, when we started doing this work, there were 34 state prisons. The reduction is actually as a result of and through the efforts of impacted people who are being poured into, invested in, and empowered to engage, and are meaningfully reducing the footprint of our carceral system here across the state, reducing the prison population, and ultimately contributing to decarceration, which one thing that we try to bring to the public into public view is that decarceration increases funding for other resources that communities can use and leverage to prevent the need for prisons in the first place. And so the work that folks inside of our prisons are doing is helping to build the futures that, our generations can experience that actually honors everyone's humanity. So I just want to kind of point that out. But we have a political education newsletter that goes out to about a third of California state prison population 4 times a year. We also have a civic education curriculum that is available to all folks in California state prisons via state issued tablets. And then we have multiple levels of training and workshops and in-person programs that educate and engage people inside in our state legislative process. So as Dr. Kristen Budd with the Sentencing Project mentioned, their studies found that what people in Maine and Vermont sort of needed in order to meaningfully participate or meaningfully vote was better access to political information. There are, models across the nation, for example, here in California, where that access to information is happening. And also echoing Dr. Kristen, but it is happening through peer-to-peer networks. And that is the network through which this work happens here in California. We also conduct leadership development inside and outside of the prisons. And so we have a 12-week organizing, leadership and political advocacy or policy advocacy training that happens across communities throughout California. And that also is mirrored inside of the prisons through workshops and programs that are peer-led and workshops and programs that are led by formerly incarcerated people who go back inside and teach these programs as well. And that has resulted in over 800 organizers across the state that contribute to criminal justice advocacy here in the state of California. As a result of this organizing model, we have engaged in over 20 campaigns, and we have changed over 15 laws that have been led and driven by impacted people. In our earliest efforts, that looked like eliminating medical and dental copays inside of prisons, increasing access to rehabilitative programming in the facilities, and most recently, I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about some of that, but other efforts that we've recently accomplished look like improving language access in California's parole process. We just recently last year increased pay for incarcerated firefighters who were previously receiving anywhere from $2 to $5 a day and are now being paid the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. And this work is all being led and driven by the insights, perspectives, and leadership of people who are impacted. And so when we hear from folks who maybe aren't familiar with this kind of work or aren't familiar with the impacts of incarceration, that folks in our prisons or folks who have been impacted by our criminal justice system don't care about being engaged in our democratic processes. That is the furthest thing from the truth. So a little bit more about some of our impacts and our accomplishments through the political education newsletter that I talked about briefly on the last slide, called the Inside Journal. We've reached over 61,000 people who have been incarcerated in California state prisons. To put that into perspective, at any given time, currently there are about 90 to 95,000 people in our state prisons. So through this journal, we reach an overwhelming majority of our prison population, but that is only by record of the numbers we can track, which are the individuals that we are mailing this newsletter to. This political education newsletter actually gets distributed beyond those on our direct mailing list through the trusted relationships, word of mouth, and peer-to-peer networks inside of the prison. So we imagine that we've reached far more people than that who have consistent access to tools and resources to be able to engage civically despite not being able to cast a ballot to impact change. One thing that I want to acknowledge about this particular newsletter is we also recognize the whole person that exists inside of our prisons. And there are multiple, I think, instances, especially when programming or resources are provided by folks who haven't experienced incarceration, where the humanity of a person gets forgotten about because they are currently caged in a prison. Well, we try to invest in the whole person also through this political education newsletter, because we provide things like a wellness corner. We provide an art corner. We share stories, and we bridge connections through what used to be 6 pages, but now 8 pages of content that is some political education, but also provides some of that additional content. We've restored voting rights to, at the time in 2020, 50,000 Californians on parole. Today, there are about, we average in California 30 to 35,000 people on parole. But as Dr. Robert Stewart was talking about, prior to in the 2000s and prior to 2020, people on parole in California could not vote. Today, people on parole in California can vote. And that effort was led by currently and formerly incarcerated people and their families across California and partners nationally as well. And Proposition 17 passed off the November 2020 ballot with the highest percentage of yes votes of all 12 measures on the ballot that year. And that speaks tremendously to the power of people and voices of community power, really. I want to talk a little bit more about this piece because Lenora, you shared about the work that you all are doing at FRRC in Florida to sort of put the responsibility or the onus on the state to inform returning citizens if they could vote or if they still owe a fee or owe funds in order to vote. Well, in California, we are experiencing the same with folks who are on parole, where we were hearing from people coming home that the only reason they knew that they were able to vote was either through peer-to-peer word of mouth or through Initiate Justice, because we send that newsletter inside and put those reminders each time, or other organizations, but they were being misinformed by both printed material and verbal responses from their parole officers or the California Department of Corrections Division of Adult Parole Operations, so AKA parole officers and administration, that they didn't have the right to vote. And so this work continues to actually make sure people on parole can adequately exercise that right. And so we actually recently, in working to put the responsibility on the state to inform people coming home that they have the right to vote, we pressured the California Secretary of State to officially designate the CDCR, or California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, parole unit or parole offices as voter registration agencies under the National Voter Registration Act. And so similarly, that is one of the barriers that we continue to face. And I'll talk a little bit also about some of the work on the next slide, some of the work that we've done in order to put some of that onus on the state when it comes to folks in our jails who have their right to vote, but face barriers in actually accessing that right to vote. But I also want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been able to do to bring incarcerated voices at the forefront of efforts to restore voting rights to people in prison. And so we were able to recently survey over 1,100 incarcerated people about voting rights. And it factually challenges the common misconception that incarcerated people don't want to vote, because in our survey, we found that they want to actively contribute to their communities. They are, in many cases, actively contributing to their communities, and they do want to participate in our democracy, with 97.5% of respondents saying that if they could vote, they absolutely would. And I'll talk more about some of this research, but I want to confirm that that response held true across all demographics, regardless of race, gender, age, security level, the amount of time that they served or have left on their sentence. Across all demographics, folks inside overwhelmingly confirmed that if they had the right to vote, they would cast their ballot. So I know I'm probably up against the 15-minute time here, so I'm going to try to kind of breeze through a little bit through some of this a little bit more. But before I jump into some of the challenges and lessons that we learned, I'm actually going to go back for just a minute, because some of the other work that we've been able to accomplish, and I know, Rachel, you briefly mentioned this, the importance of it, has expanded far beyond just the sort of conditions of confinement, because more recently we've been able to work across a coalition of advocates throughout the state to, for the first time, bring civil protections against racial bias into California's criminal courtroom through the California Racial Justice Act. And so as of 2020, and through a series of additional legislation that made it retroactive, and that has continued to strengthen its effectiveness, racial bias and racial discrimination can now be challenged in criminal courtrooms if it had a bearing on charging, conviction, or sentencing. So some of the most historical efforts are happening at the hands of impacted people. Additionally, I briefly mentioned it, but as Dr. Kristen Budd talked about with studies in Maine and Vermont, that people inside need better access in order to access their rights, need in-person voting in order to exercise their rights. We found the same held true in California jails, where people do not lose their right to vote, but oftentimes don't have the access to the information or the actual ability to cast their ballot. And so we worked in the last legislative cycle, 2023 to 2024, with California State Assembly member Isaac Bryan, to bring in-person voting or in-person polling stations in our California jails. And while that effort did not succeed, particularly because of two things. One, claim is funding, which we know is a consistent barrier, but also because even after passing a bill through the state legislature by winning the majority of votes of over 120 state legislative offices, the bill was vetoed by the California governor. And so although it did not make it into law, it definitely did show and demonstrate that both our local and our state elected officials do agree that in-person voting and better access to the ballot box should be a focus for Californians, particularly Californians in our jail. So I wanted to also touch on some of that other work that we've done. So what are the challenges and lessons that we learned? I think they align with some of my other panelists and our sort of range in both depth and breadth, but I want to talk about a couple, which are one, the consistent battle against misconceptions and stereotypes, and some of them are listed here that we work to counter. The first, which we all know here today on this panel is not correct, but that people in prisons don't care about participating in our democracy. And that is simply false. Like I said, nearly 98% of the incarcerated people who we surveyed said that they would vote if they could. And to Julius Irving's point, what he talked about earlier was oftentimes it's meeting people where they are, which is a core premise of the work that we do here at Initiate Justice, is when you are able to meet people where they are and connect their civic participation to their livelihood, you then begin to recognize they recognize the stake. Well, we know that people in our prisons recognize the stake because decisions are consistently being made about the conditions under which they are required to live, but they aren't considered constituents when those decisions are being made. And so this is a common misconception that we have found is false, and you can access more details about that report that we published at initiatejustice.org/report-the-road-to-democracy. But also people in prison would all vote the same way. This again is rooted in a deeply embedded stereotype that people in prisons are monolith, and they are not. People in prisons carry a myriad of different identities that impact how they show up in their views and perspectives far more than their current conditions of confinement. And I want to sort of point out that in our survey, what we found when it came to sort of the views and perspectives of folks is that the most important issue or top issue that people cared about varied across ethnic identities. So our Black and African American population, racial justice was the #1 most very important issue that they cared about. Among our white identifying population, criminal justice reforms were the #1 most important issue that they cared about. Among our AAPI community, inside, based upon the folks that we surveyed, racial justice was among the #1. Among our Latinx community incarcerated that we surveyed, education was the #1 most very important. And then among our Native and Indigenous communities that we surveyed inside of California state prisons, jobs, fair wages, and workers' rights were among the #1 most important issue that they cared about. So no, people in prisons would not all vote the same way. They carry other identities and experience that shape their views and perspectives and beliefs, and we have to continue to counter that misconception in our everyday work. The last one, people in prisons are disconnected from their community and uninformed about policies. The work that we've done here far and wide across California and in some other states debunks that myth, because people are informed when efforts are made to inform them or when they have access to the information to inform themselves. And while they may not be connected to their communities in ways that they were prior to incarceration, oftentimes they still have children who are attending schools and communities from which they come, or they have family members and loved ones, and some are oftentimes giving back to their communities. We have inside organizers here in California who have established entire nonprofit organizations alongside their family in order to contribute back to the youth in their community and repair the harms that they caused. I think other lessons learned through this report is that incarcerated people want to vote because they want to contribute they want to contribute to positive change. And I'm starting to talk fast because I think it's been about 20 minutes. And they want to have a voice in society. And then I also just want to emphasize that although the top most important issue that people cared about varied inside, based upon our survey, there were two that remained consistent and among the top issue across every single ethnicity, and that was healthcare, and that was jobs, fair wages, and workers' rights. So I think there's a lot more that I could talk about given the time, but if you have questions, please drop them. I want to just name a couple of things here of the work that incarcerated people in California are doing. Currently, a group of 12 incarcerated people developed and are moving a bill through the California State Legislature alongside our team. Participants in our pilot program were given the opportunity to develop any legislative proposal and introduce it in the 2026 state legislative cycle. And they chose a bill to strengthen social emotional learning in K through 12 schools as a prevention method or a disruption to the school to prison pipeline. And I think that speaks volumes to the things that people inside care about or would contribute to if given the meaningful opportunity to. I think something else that I would want people to walk away knowing who maybe aren't familiar with our criminal justice system is that incarcerated people are coming home. And they are preparing now to come home later. More than 90% of California's incarcerated population have a legal pathway to release, meaning they have a release date or they have a parole hearing date, and an overwhelming majority of them will come home. In 2024 and 25 alone, over 53,000 people have come home from California state prison. So when we are investing in the civic engagement and belonging of folks in our prisons, we are investing in the civic engagement and belonging and connection of our communities. I think I can wrap it up here and just ask folks to stay engaged, stay involved. I can drop all these links into the chat in a moment, but you can access the report along with other reports at initiatejustice.org/publications. You can listen to our podcast, which is one of, I think, the most compelling ways that we found to share the stories of formerly incarcerated people and their loved ones through their experiences and insights about how we can root out systems of harm and violence through an abolitionist praxis. And that is at initiatejustice.org/abolition is for everybody with hyphens between each word. And you can sign up for our mailing list to stay involved and stay connected at initiatejustice.org. Sign up. You can also sign up an incarcerated loved one if you have someone incarcerated in a California state prison who you would wish to receive our political education newsletter. You can support our work at initiatejustice.org/donate, and you can follow us on social media, which is at Initiate Justice on all platforms.
Amazing. Thank you so very much. It's just really incredible too to see the through lines between civic agency and collective power building. I'm sure all of you are working along those dimensions in just such powerful ways. So I would like to now open it up. We have some questions. Some of them have been kind of partially answered in the Q&A, but I'm going to uplift them anyway because I think they're germane to a lot of the panelists. And also I wanted to say regarding resources, we do circle back with the panelists afterwards to ask for if they would be willing to share slide decks and also other resources, and we post those on our event page. So anyone in the audience or even the panelists, if you're listening to one another and trying to track what's being shared, don't worry about it. We will make sure that that is disseminated. Just give us a few weeks to get it all together and post it. So, okay, I'm going to prioritize. So the first question that was shared, which I know was, question, is it okay to use first names with the panelists as I'm addressing you? Is that okay? Okay. Perfect. So the first question that Carrie Banks had posed was around to Kristen, and that was whether there are people working on voting rights for incarcerated youth, specifically ages 18 to 21. And Kristen did respond to that, but I wanted to put that out to the wider panel and actually tag on a little bit to not just about voting rights, but more expansively around civic engagement. I also do a lot of work with youth, and many of them are civically engaged in various ways. And then there's also, just to be frank, a lot of young people that are like, what is going on with the democracy these days? And why should I get involved in, the system that clearly is broken? So would love to hear people speak to that in any order.
I would echo what Kristen had said in the chat, basically that I'm not personally aware of any organizations working specifically for restoring voting rights for younger people who are incarcerated. As most organizations are definitely focused more on, I think, just expanding by correctional status. So, if in a state where people are prison or are disenfranchised for life, to limit that to the sentence, or in states when the sentence limited to prison or whatever. And there are, increasing efforts. I started this talking about, saying that this was a positive story, but just to be very clear, and I think many of the other panelists, made this case. The effort shouldn't stop at the gates of the prison wall, right? I say this as a person I was disenfranchised for almost 10 years, while in prison and after. And I was in prison during the 2008 election, and some of the most engaging political conversations I've ever had, before or since, were while I was in prison. And and that was a particular campaign that a lot of people were really energized about, but it was still it was all most people were talking about. And so I do think that there are I think we can't just stop and say, okay, well, prison is okay. This is a relatively unique American thing, to be very clear, right? So like in lots of other countries and countries that we tend to compare ourselves to, this isn't a thing, taking people's voting rights away. The other thing I did want to mention, to your point, Rachel, about there are more organizations today, I think, that have started, not many, but who are focusing on how can we engage younger people, system impacted on younger people in the political process. And I look at Julius and some of the work they're doing. It's, about not just about voting, but about civic power and solidarity and building a strength, in the community, amongst the community, in the community. And so those are the things that I just wanted to highlight.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just name that while Initiate Justice doesn't exclusively focus on our youth population, we partner with a lot of organizations that have, and folks that graduated from our program have gone and reached back and do that work now today. And so there are two organizations I drop in different sort of sides or coastal sides of California that are doing work to engage youth who are either currently confined or formerly confined in our advocacy or civic processes. And so would highly encourage that. I think one really incredible model that actually Youth Justice LA has is actually complemented by a charter school in which they are funneling people out of the juvenile halls into a sort of charter school that then empowers civic engagement. And so would really sort of recommend learning about Youth Justice LA as
well. They do incredible work. I agree. Others want to share about their work with young people?
Okay, I don't specifically work with young people. I work with just everybody in the community, but specifically the adults. But I do know of an organization in town called Scrum, I did mentoring, that works specifically with young people between the ages of 18, I think like 15 to 25. And recently I saw him doing like voter registration drive where he was trying to aim at getting a certain number of young people registered to vote, coupled with some political education and just how to utilize their vote. But that's the only organization that I've personally seen in town that was focused on younger people from the demographic that I serve. So Scrum-Minded Mentoring, and the guy named is Jarrell Whitehead.
Thank you. We will add it to our resources. Yeah, where I am based, we have a budget justice coalition that's starting to do more intentional work with young people, hopefully to shift resources from the budget invested in things like collateral consequences to more prevention oriented, and to our public defender, and rather than our sheriff's office and district attorney. Okay, let's see what else people have asked. We have, this is a question, I think the question is for Julius. What issues were, and I would just add, are incarcerated people most interested in? Has voting addressed these issues? Did it increase opportunities for housing, jobs, and healthcare? And I think even though I think this would be applicable to many people on the panel as well. So,
can you state the question one more time?
Yeah. So, question, I'm going to read it from, we have a shared doc, but I'm going to look at it in the Q&A. What issues were incarcerated people interested in? Did voting address these issues? Did it increase opportunities for housing, jobs, healthcare?
Okay, so the incarcerated people that I encounter, the issue that they were most concerned about were the conditions in the county jail. They were concerned about housing when they came home and about finding gainful employment. Those are some of the main things, that they're focused on, pretty much just having stability when they come home. Because, it's hard to ask a person, because even 60 to 90 days of incarceration is enough time for a person to lose their apartment, lose their car, lose out of their clothes. So it's hard to ask that demographic to care about long-term change through political engagement when they have so many immediate needs. But through the helping them address their immediate needs, you can get them the skill sets required for participation in long-term change. So yeah, I've been kind of looking at it that way, and also utilizing community service, right? Because we want to reimagine community service, not as free labor, but as something that's beneficial to a person from a community. If I invest in you as a member of your community, when you go back, we serve your community. So some of the things that we're doing here in the process of utilizing the system as is to help achieve our initiative is having people fulfill their community service obligations through taking our political education course. But some of the main things for a person that I've seen them be concerned about the most across the board is just reestablishing stability after coming home. And yeah, so I'll leave it there, and I'll leave room for the other panelists to answer.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Julius is saying. For the returning citizens that we work with, the main things is housing. It is finding a good job. With the fines and fees that we are able to help them to eradicate at the end of the day. I can give an example of one person that recently got her fines and fees taken care of. And as a result, she was able to get an exemption that allowed her to then be able to get a promotion on her job, something that was kind of a hindrance before that, because these fines and fees was a barrier to that. And now, as a result of this promotion, she has an autistic child. She's able to do more things for her family, right? Like it gives her more opportunities to take care of her family, put food on the table, do the things that she needs to do because now she's bringing in more money. And so, yeah, that's how, that would be my answer to, we don't necessarily, our organizing department does work with individuals in the jail, but Amendment 4 is after an individual, for the most part, is out of jail done with parole, done with probation. But our organizer, his name is Marquise, and he does go into the jails and he talks about, Amendment 4 and the work that we do with other partnering organizations so that when folks come out and they need to get back stable, as Julius was saying, they have the resources and they know the places to go, because a lot of times it's for lack of knowledge, not knowing what to do, where to go. And so then people are lost. But when they have a connection, they know somebody that they can reach out to that can, navigate them the way they need to go. It then helps them on that path to get where they need to be.
Yeah, and I'll weigh in here and mostly focus on some of the survey results from the respondents that are currently incarcerated in California. And I do want to be very clear that I think there is a important distinction between sort of what folks incarcerated or returning care about that are urgent needs for their livelihood versus what they care about overall, or that aligns with their values. And so when the folks that we surveyed inside, I want to highlight that over 25% of respondents were serving 21 years, anywhere between 21 years to life, or condemned to die in prison, in other words. And of those respondents, I want to make very clear that while over 90% identified criminal justice reforms and education as the two most very important issues, other issues that 80% or more of people deemed as very important included healthcare, victim and survivor rights and services, racial justice, ending poverty and economic inequality, healthcare, and jobs, fair wages, and worker rights. So the issues that they care about extend far beyond, I think, what their immediate needs are when given the opportunity to sort of determine based on their values versus based on urgency and survival. Other issues that 75% or more folks deemed as very important included protecting the environment, protecting reproductive rights, housing and ending homelessness, and preventing gun violence.
Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, and I'm glad you talked about healthcare, because to me that also shows a through line between the immediate needs and the impact of voting. Because right now, we are all navigating a healthcare crisis, and that the phased impacts of which are, still yet to come. But definitely a connection there. The other thing I wanted to lift up that Julius mentioned, Community Springs, Julius mentioned the pivots. One of their pivots is just income. They have a guaranteed income program that they've run. I think you're in your fourth cycle, maybe fourth cohort. Can't remember. Kevin might be on the call, but fourth cohort. And it's incredible because it really shows the pathway between, that near-term economic stability and then what that allows for people to really, yes, expand and seize upon civic engagement to care for their communities and families in new ways. Like that is the linchpin. And then once that is secure, all of the other things really fall into place. So we'll include that resource in the link too, because that program is just astonishing. Okay. Let me see here. I think there's a question, we're American Library Association, so we like to ask questions about libraries and, engagement with civic institutions. And so curious about your involvement with any libraries of any kind, academic, public, in your communities. And then maybe to expand upon that, just to think about partnerships, because we've talked about, how you are looking at the whole person, and the whole person needs a lot of different things. And your work is more powerful by virtue of connecting with people who are working on some similar issues and with similar populations. So if I could ask about, if there's work with libraries, and then broadening that to different agencies, partnerships of varying kinds.
Well, I can speak for Ohio. So up here, I live, 45 minutes south of Cleveland. So there's been events at the Cleveland Public Library where they bring in me and other speakers. One was Jeannie Austin from California, who does a lot. Yeah, I love her. So they did the panel. I spoke specifically on voting rights. They also had someone there from the Marshall Project. So I know the Cleveland Public Library does bring in a lot of speakers to help with public education, and then to get the word out on the way libraries can intersect with people coming home, resources for them. So yeah, so that's something I've been involved in here in Ohio.
That's great.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Go ahead, you first.
Yeah, I was just going to name that we actually have a team member, formerly incarcerated team member, that works with the San Francisco Public Library and has spoken on panels with the American Library Association on a consistent effort to increase or expand information access inside of facilities. And so that collaboration has gone on for a few years now. And we also worked a few years ago with California State Assembly member Isaac Bryan to create some accountability and oversight for around banned books inside of our state prisons.
Yeah, actually, it was that last point I was going to mention about there's an artist named Daniel McCarthy Clifford who I know a little bit, but had a just a really fascinating exhibit at the Weissman Art Museum at the University of Minnesota, which was it was called the section of disapproved books. And so basically what he did is he went around and collected the list, or lists of banned books from all the departments of corrections around the country, and then created this kind of like a mini library section in this museum. And it was and it was fascinating because the variation in terms of look, like, we live in a time of more books being banned now than, and so it's and this was a couple of years ago when he was doing this. So it seems almost quaint now, but like the breadth and variety of or the scope of what was being banned varies so much from state to state. And it's, somewhere it's like, okay, you can't have the anarchist cookbook or something. And others where it's like, oh, you also can't have, Josh Page, who's a professor that writes on various things. And he wrote a book about the California Prison Guards Union. Learned that his book was banned in California, so, or at least for a while. Right. And so I definitely encourage. I don't know if Daniel is still has that exhibit going anywhere, but it was one of the most fascinating things that I had seen.
Yeah, I appreciate. Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just briefly add, and I'll say publicly, hey, Lee, it looks like our community advocacy manager who does hold that relationship with the San Francisco Public Library is here on the webinar, but he wanted to also emphasize that we've been able to connect to the San Francisco Public Library directly with folks inside regarding transparency. We've also been able to conduct surveys for the library so they can better serve the population inside with documents that they might need when they're returning home, such as birth certificates, social security cards, or how to write resumes. And so I wanted to uplift that into the space of some of the impact of that relationship with the San Francisco Public Library.
Yes, the San Francisco Public Library does amazing work. It's but a lot of libraries, public library systems do. I was going to mention about the banned books. There's actually a bill tracking through to in California specifically to provide more oversight around why they're banning books, what books they're banning, because right now it is so, there's just no transparency, there's no accountability. So that is happening. And the other thing, just to lift up too, to even go back to what Kristen was saying initially about the lack of information. I mean, so many, and you all probably know this, like jails and prisons are primarily information deserts. And in terms of libraries, there's no set funding model, let alone like, this is what it should look like. And oftentimes they're understaffed or unstaffed. And so that gap in information access and information equity is really, really real. And it affects obviously not just what we're talking about in terms of civic participation and voting rights, but everything about being there and staying connected and then coming home. So I would urge those of you who are not already working with libraries and on these issues, they make great partners, and they're also, primary resources for people who do come home and want to get connected with community services. Okay, let's see. Or I should check the time. We have probably time for one or two more questions. see what we have here. I think I'll pose this question, which is, what maybe are the most common or frustrating obstacles that you encounter in advancing this work? And I know, Antoinette talked a little bit about lessons learned. Maybe there's a piece of that too. And you've talked a little bit about debunking some of the stereotypes, which I really appreciate. But just, in moving this work, which is challenging, and also there are some positive directions, like what have you kind of come across that's still puzzling or unsettling or just really demands more attention and sustained labor?
So I will say for us, with our fines and fees program, the courts, we have been, Amendment 4 is a law that there's not a lot of precedent behind it. And so folks interpret it the way they want to interpret it. And we are starting to see judges do that in a way that it does not help the returning citizen. And so, we are pushing back against it because at the end of the day, this was something that the Florida residents voted for, and the courts are kind of saying that they have a discretion, and their discretion is not to allow it. And that is something that makes for the most part, Amendment 4 invalid. And so, that is one of the biggest hurdles I would say that we are recently seeing. I think one of the other things too is kind of getting more attorneys involved in our work. Um, I'm like I said, I was a public defender. I get it. Attorneys are busy, but this work is important. It's impactful. Taking on one case makes a difference in a person's life, and as I said, it has a ripple effect that it translates to their family and to their community. And so, a lot of times, they're like, "Oh, I kind of already have a lot going on. This is just going to be, something added to my plate that they're not able to have the time to dedicate it to, or they have the intent in the beginning, but then the follow through is not always there." And so, kind of just getting attorneys to come in, even if you take a case but see it through to the end. I promise you, if you do it and you see how much we help in upfront, like you'll want to take on more cases because it's not a heavy lift and it makes such a huge impact. So those are just a few of the things I would say as it relates to fines and fees like that we're seeing and that we're dealing with.
I'd
So,
like to, oh, go ahead, Rob.
well, I was just the thing that, as a person who had worked in this from an advocacy perspective for a number of years while I was, both in college and grad school before I came here or took my current job. And then now someone who kind of writes about this and kind of talks to a lot of advocates and organizations and also opponents around, or people that are like resisting voting rights restoration around the country. A thing that I run into frequently that really is aggravating is the partisan advocates, people that are pushing for these things for partisan objectives and not for necessarily, you know, like as others have said, like we're talking about real, actual human being people, right? People who have value and people who are complex and people who have, I've had, had long conversations with, for example, organizations who wanted to fund some engagement work, right? How can we encourage people to engage in the criminal, but then when I start talking about, well, just so you know, that this might not lead to like a big, huge, overwhelmingly Democratic, support for Democratic candidates or something, then it's like, oh, well, actually, never mind. We don't want to support that. Right. And so like, based on, so we've talked about different kind of levels of policy and, how like very personal individual, policy and, getting jobs and housing and stuff after reentry, and then also like community level stuff, and then federal policy, right? Like immigration or abortion or these other kinds of things. And one of the, based on surveys that I've done, national surveys of people in the community, not incarcerated people, but people in the community, including people with criminal records, People particularly with felony records don't hold the same kind of organized political views in a lot of ways, right? So you might have, they might have strong support for things like, progressive economic policies, and whether it's healthcare, support, like community healthcare programs and things like that, but also you know supportive of gun right, having like strong gun rights, or maybe not, maybe supportive of restrictive immigration, but supportive of a right to abortion access or healthcare. And so like there, I guess we're talking about, just like anybody else, we're talking about complex people, but that had maybe a different civic education, because maybe not being exposed to, these things, because when you're a disenfranchised person, you're not on a voting list, so you're not getting all the mailers in a lot of cases, right? Because that's where those campaigns get those things. And so I guess what I would say is people that are doing this because they want their party to win or their side to win. Like I have my personal views and beliefs and things that I really, and it's sometimes it's hard, but like it's hard, but it's more important for me that the inclusionary aspect of voting access and kind of the respect for individual human beings is more important for me from at a conviction level than it is for the party or the candidate that I want to win. That also means that it doesn't, that the organizations that do want to do those things, I think they need to work harder. These are not people that these are people are gettable, and I think you just have to make the case, but they're not always going to line up exactly. So I have a couple papers, for example, that kind of show like people with felony records tend to be kind of more moderate, in part because they have mixed views on things, when you can't necessarily predict their different viewpoints on things based on and so I just give people the space to hold different views and don't impose these things on people and whatnot. So that's it. Just it's about the principle, and it should be about the principle, not about winning an election.
Go ahead, Dr. Kristen.
I think it segues, and I'll just be very, very quick. The hardest thing for me as a researcher is that we then go on to make recommendations. And then what happens with the recommendations, right? That's always the biggest question mark, because you often don't get access to go in a second time to see what's changed or to see what's been implemented. So I don't know. I'll throw it out into the universe. Maybe someday I'll be able to go back into Maine and Vermont and see if things have changed and what's changed and what obstacles are still there. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly echo a lot of what you just said, Robert, around despite one's incarceration or relationship to the criminal legal system, these are whole, complex human beings. And I think that not only are they whole, complex human beings, they are whole, complex human beings who carry oftentimes tons of trauma and a lifetime often of oppression. And so when you are navigating that, I think it provides, especially for an organization like ours, who's an advocacy and power building organization, that our duty then becomes not just to provide the information, the access to, and the resources, but also to instill and inspire and cultivate hope among this very population, consistency, and as a part of our practice, for the purpose of sort of investing in the whole person, but also for the purpose of this consistent trade-off that we are having to strategically make between meeting immediate or addressing immediate and urgent efforts or issues, as well as achieving the long game or the long-term goal. And like that trade-off can sometimes be hard. It can be difficult. It can feel disappointing and discouraging to folks inside when they're already navigating a system that consistently, daily is stripping them of their rights and their voice. And so just wanting to echo a lot of what's said and remind folks that we have to invest in people, and we have to cultivate hope as a part of our practice.
Yes, I love that. Mariam Kaba's hope is a discipline, right?
Hope is a
Rings
discipline.
very true. So we've already gone a few minutes over, so I'm getting the cane here to wrap us up. I'll just say a couple words. And of course, the first words will just be thank you to our panelists for sharing your expertise, your time, but really just your compassion and conviction and commitment to this work. It's inspiring. It's the thing of hope. So thank you also to our audience for coming and caring about these issues as well. We do all of these programs for free. We open them to the public, and we are committed to ensuring that CERTS programs continue to be diverse, inclusive, and free. To do this, we rely on support from the American Library Association, our membership, and direct donations. You can help champion our roundtable's mission and our commitments by donating at the link provided. We'll put it in the chat. Or we'd love to have you as a member of the Social Responsibilities Roundtable if you were not already involved. When you do this, when you donate, you can make a general gift, or you can select a CERT, Social Responsibilities Roundtable task force or award that you'd like to support. So please help us maintain our high quality programming and the core values that sustain it, and our commitment to accessibility by making a donation if you're able to. And if you're not, just by sharing the work that we're doing with any of your colleagues or friends. We really do want to be a voice of advocacy and change. Our next session is coming up in about 25 minutes, and that is focused on civic engagement and strategies for social change, the ballot, and beyond. We have a terrific slate of panelists for that one too. It's going to be dynamite. So hope you can join us, and thank you again for coming. Thank you to our panelists, and we'll be in touch with more resources. Thank you.